Welcome to today's grammar lecture on infinitive plus ba or ka and the so-called discourse marker vai he. Let's begin by talking about infinitives. An infinitive, as here in number 1, can take a preceding ba or ka preposition. When it does so, it backgrounds this verbal action to that of the main verb here. Specifically, this infinitive phrase sets the scene of this action. And when you set the scene, you can do so in one of two ways in Hebrew. You can set the scene when a certain action occurred or before a certain action occurred. And these are the two functions of ba and ka. Ba marks the temporal frame within which the main action occurred, and so you can translate ba as when, while, or as. Let's look at this example. Bihyotam basadeh vayakom kain. In their being in the field, Cain got up. So Cain's getting up happened within the time frame of Cain and Abel being in the field. And let's look at a couple more examples of this function with ba plus infinitive. Ve'rivka shoma'at bedaber Yitzchak. And Rebekah was listening in the speaking of Isaac, meaning Rebekah's listening happened within the time frame of Isaac speaking. So Rebekah was listening while Isaac was speaking. And finally, Vaiman ha'Elohim tola'at ba'alot ha'shachad. And God appointed a worm in the going up of the dawn, meaning God appointed the worm as the dawn was going up. Now, if ba marks the time frame within which the main verb action takes place, ka marks the preceding action to the main verb. Specifically, ka marks an action that is immediately preceding that of the main verb. So whereas you can translate ba when, you can translate ka after. Let's read it, then translate. Ki shmoa esav et divrei aviv vayitzak. So, as the hearing of Esau the words of his father, he cried out. And so this is the immediately preceding action. So you can say, after Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out. And we can look at a couple more examples. Kir oto ki ein hana'ar vamet. As he sees that there is not the young man, he will die. Meaning, after he sees that there is not the young man, he will die. And finally, 6. Ki zroach hashemesh, vaiman Elohim, ruach kadim charishit. So, as the rising of the sun, God appointed a wind, a stifling east wind, meaning God's appointing the stifling east wind happened after the sun rose. So ba marks the time frame when an action occurred. You can just translate ba when. Ka marks the immediately preceding action to that of the main verb, and so you can translate ka after. And here we are at the last point for today, the so-called discourse marker vai he. Before we address the special use of vai he, let's talk about the normal use. where vayehi is a hu vayiktol form of haya yihyeh. You'd expect to be able to translate it, and it was. And indeed, the three other occurrences of vayehi in the book of Jonah, it occurs just as the regular verb. As in number 7, vayehi devar Adonai el Yonah. And by regular verb, I mean there's a subject here, devar, it's masculine singular. It agrees in person, gender, and number, and so this is the subject and this is the verb. The word of Yahweh was to Jonah, exactly what you would expect. And number 8, Vayhi sa'ar gadol bayam. Subject, a great storm was on the sea. Exactly what you would expect. And number 9, Vayhi Yonah bim'e hadag. And Jonah was in the innards of the fish. Now, what you would not expect is the occurrence in 4 verse 8. Now, this occurrence of Vayhi, we've actually seen the same kind of usage back in lecture 19 with the vekatal form vehaya. Vayhi and vehaya in this special form, they don't act as a regular verb where there's a subject and this is the verb. Actually, this verb here, vayhi, it's separate from the sentence, where you see what's followed here. This is a temporal phrase, and then you've got another verb with a subject of its own. So vayhi is separate. Let's read and translate and then talk about it more. Vayhi, kizroach hashemesh, vayman Elohim, ruach kadim charishit, vatach hashemesh al rosh Yonah. Now, I put discourse marker in scare quotes because the regular interpretation of this is as a discourse marker, as I explained before. But I don't think I really define my terms as discourse marker. What most people mean by discourse marker is that the discourse marker itself has no syntactic function within the sentence in which it occurs. It actually marks the macro structure of a discourse. So it just relates this sentence in some significant structural way to the whole discourse. And why I disagree is because I believe it actually does have a syntactic function. It marks what follows as a thetic judgment rather than a categorical judgment. Just as a little review of what I said before, categorical judgment is the usual way that we speak, where we say something about an entity. So pretend you walk into the room and you knew there was butter and now you don't see the butter anymore, and so you say, "What's wrong with the butter?" The person can answer you saying, "The butter melted," where in the question you establish some entity, the butter here, and then the person who answers says something about that butter. And again, this is the normal way in which we speak, where you establish some topic and then you say something about the topic. But this isn't the only way that we as humans speak. A thetic judgment merely asserts the existence of an entity or state of affairs. So here's an example where you just assert some state of affairs. Pretend you go into a room and you just see a mess and you have no idea what it was caused by. So you say, "What happened?" And then the person says, "The butter melted." Where here you're not establishing some entity. And so here, it's not so much about the butter per se, but about this melted butter mess. Now let me go into a little more detail with a Hebrew example. All right, so say that you have a sheep and you lost the sheep and you don't know where it is, so you walk up to a guy and say, "Eifo hakeves?" And then the person says, "Hakeves al hakiseh." Where here you're establishing some entity, the sheep. I want to know about the sheep. And so the person says, "Yeah, the sheep," and then makes some statement about it. "It's on the chair." Now, this is opposed to a Atheitic judgment. Say I walk up to a guy and I say, Shev al hakiseh. And the person gives me this following reason for why he can't sit on the chair. Yesh kevis al hakiseh. Now, this one, the sheep is on the chair, and there is a sheep on the chair. You're basically saying the same kind of thing, but you're saying it in a different way. Here, the focus is on the sheep. Here, the focus is on the chair. And it would actually sound strange if you walked up to a guy and said, Shev al hakiseh, and the person answered with a categorical statement, Hakevis al hakiseh. That would sound weird because you're like, I'm not talking about a sheep at all. I said sit on the chair, and now you say the sheep is on the chair. All right? So this is an example where you use atheitic judgment to merely assert the existence of an entity. Now, what Vehaya and Vayehi do is it marks the following as a thetic judgment where you assert the existence of a state of affairs. And so the import of this is that when it says, and it happened, after the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun struck Jonah's head, where really the only important thing here is that Jonah's head gets struck. It's not so significant about the wind and the sun per se, but that Jonah's head gets struck. And so you ask yourself, what's so significant about Jonah's head being struck? And this is where, actually, even though I follow Daniel Wilson in saying Vehayan Vayehi do have a syntactic function by marking the following as a thetic judgment, it actually is still on parallel with the discourse marker analysis, where it still provides structure to the discourse, where it still marks the climax of some kind of episode. Here, it's very significant for the book of Jonah, where you only have one instance of Vayehi as a marker of a thetic judgment, and it separates this little episode out from the rest of the structure of Jonah and really highlights it as the climax of the entire book. Because with the book of Jonah, you have these corresponding halves, where in chapter 1 and in chapter 3, you have the word of God telling Jonah to rise and walk to Nineveh and give them a message. And then each time, it's followed by Jonah encountering Gentiles and God relenting of his wrath. The sea calmed and God didn't overturn the city of Nineveh. And then it's followed by Jonah praying to God, where Jonah prays in the belly of the fish, and he's asking God for deliverance. But then in chapter 4, Jonah prays, and he's angry at God that God delivered Nineveh. And now you have this episode where Jonah receives judgment in his head being struck, and how's he going to respond? Where earlier God let him experience redemption, now what if God lets Jonah experience some of his wrath? And this becomes the object lesson and the important point being driven home of the entire book, marked here by Vayehi.